We are often taught that death is the ultimate tyranny, the final silence imposed by a despot upon his subjects. But beneath the marble splendor of Imperial Rome, there lurked a darkness far more profound, a calculated malevolence that realized true power lay not in ending a life, but in dismantling the human spirit piece by agonized peace. This is not merely a story of blood. It is a chronicle of how one man turned the human soul into a plaything. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was not born a monster. He was forged in the fires of betrayal and paranoia, a survivor who learned that to rule was to terrify. To understand his reign is to gaze into the abyss of absolute power, where the line between divinity and depravity vanishes. If you possess the courage to confront these shadows of antiquity, signal your presence by liking this video and subscribing. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching the empire fall tonight. To comprehend the machinery of terror that would one day grind Rome into submission, one must first look not at a tyrant, but at a child. A small boy of perhaps 6 or 7 years, running through the mud and glorious chaos of a military encampment on the Germanic frontier. The year is 14 AD, and the air is thick with the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of sharpened iron. The soldiers, hardened veterans who have conquered half the known world, do not look upon this child with fear, but with adoration. They lift him onto their shoulders, their rough laughter mingling with the cold northern wind, and they call him by a nickname derived from the miniature soldier's boots he wears. Caligula, or Little Boots, he is the son of Germanicus, the golden general of Rome, a man whose very name inspires a fervent, dangerous hope in the hearts of the legions. At this moment, surrounded by the protective wall of shields and the unwavering loyalty of 10,000 men, the boy believes in a world where he is safe, where he is loved, and where power is a noble instrument used to protect the weak. But this innocence, like the fragile peace of the frontier, was destined to be shattered by the ruthless mechanics of imperial politics. The destruction of his soul began not with a single act of violence, but with a slow, corrosive erosion of his reality. When his father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned by agents of the reigning Emperor Tiberius, the boy was thrust into a nightmare from which there was no awakening. His mother was exiled and starved to death. His brothers were imprisoned and driven to suicide, their pleas for mercy echoing unanswered in stone cells until they were silenced by the grave. By the time he was a teenager, Caligula was the last survivor of his bloodline, summoned to live with the very man who had orchestrated the annihilation of his family, the Emperor Tiberius, on the island of Capri to the outside world. It was a paradise of limestone cliffs and azure waters, but the historian Suetonius, writing with the grim precision of one documenting a plague, reveals the truth hidden within its villas. It was a prison of exquisite depravity. Here, the aging Emperor Tiberius had retreated from the world to indulge in appetites so grotesque, so devoid of human empathy, that even to whisper of them in Rome was to invite execution. For the young Caligula, survival in this viper's nest required a psychological mutilation far more severe than any physical torture. He had to suppress every instinct of grief, every flash of anger, every tear for his murdered mother and brothers. He had to smile at the man who killed them. He had to pour wine for the monster, laugh at his cruel jokes, and become, as Suetonius famously observed, the perfect servant, day after day, year after year. He wore a mask of placid obedience, burying his rage so deep that it began to fester, transforming into something cold, calculated, and entirely inhuman. He learned that empathy was a weakness, that morality was a fiction invented by the weak to restrain the strong, and that the only true law in the universe was the will of the one who held the power of life and death. When Tiberius finally expired, whether by natural causes or, as some whispered, helped along by the slow suffocation of a pillow, the Caligula who emerged to claim the throne was no longer the beloved little boots of the Rhine legions. The boy was dead, and in his place stood a man who had survived hell by becoming one of its demons. The empire rejoiced at his ascension, cheering the son of Germanicus as a savior who would restore the light of the Augustan age, unaware that they were welcoming a master of psychological warfare who had spent his formative years studying the architecture of terror. For the first few months, the mask remained in place. He lowered taxes, recalled exiles, and staged lavish games. But then, a mysterious illness struck him. A fever that burned through the palace for weeks. When the fever broke, the mask shattered with it. The man who rose from that sickbed looked the same. But the eyes were different. They no longer held the caution of a survivor, but the cold, predatory gleam of a god who realizes that the world exists solely for his amusement, and thus began the systematic dismantling of the Roman psyche. Starting with the one emotion that united all humanity, grief. This brings us to the first act of his terror machine, a twisting of natural law so profound that it left the Senate paralyzed in confusion. Caligula had 3 sisters, but for Drusilla, he held an affection that the ancient sources, including Cassius Dio, suggest transcended the bounds of sibling love. Whether their relationship was truly incestuous or merely a manifestation of his desperate need for a connection that Tiberius could not destroy, is historically debated. But the psychological impact of her death was absolute. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula did not merely mourn her, he weaponized her absence. He declared her a goddess, the first Roman woman to be deified, and in doing so, he laid a trap for the entire population of Rome. Normally, mourning is a private sanctuary, a time when the crushing weight of loss allows one to withdraw from the demands of the state. But Caligula, in a stroke of twisted genius, inverted this universal truth. Because Drusilla was now a goddess, to mourn her death was to deny her divinity. It was a theological contradiction. Therefore, he decreed that mourning was forbidden, but simultaneously, because she was his beloved sister. Not to honor her was treason. The Roman people found themselves trapped in a double bind, a psychological term for a dilemma where every choice leads to punishment. He declared a period of suspended time where normal life ceased to exist. Imagine, for a moment, the atmosphere in the streets of Rome during those suffocating weeks. The air is heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and stagnant dust. For the emperor has decreed that bathing is a sign of disrespect to the new goddess. Families gather around dinner tables in hushed silence, the flickering oil lamps casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. For sharing a meal with one's kin is now considered a capital offense. A father looks at his children, terrified that a sudden burst of laughter or a careless game might be overheard by the network of informers that Caligula has embedded in every neighborhood. To laugh is to die, for it shows a lack of solemnity. To cry is to die, for it suggests Drusilla is merely human. The historian Suetonius recounts that during this period, a man committed the crime of selling hot water, a trivial, everyday act of commerce, and for this, he was condemned to death. Why? because the transaction implied that life was continuing as normal, and Caligula demanded that the world stop spinning because he willed it so. He was testing the limits of his control, not over the bodies of his subjects, but over their internal emotional landscapes. He was teaching them a lesson that would underpin his entire reign, that their feelings, their habits, their very perception of reality were subject to his revision. If he said that grief was joy, then they must rejoice. If he said that day was night, they must light their lamps. By the time the period of mourning ended, he had achieved something that Tiberius, with all his dungeons and executioners, never could. He had made the entire population of Rome complicit in his madness, forcing them to police their own facial expressions, to monitor their own heartbeats, lest a single slip of genuine emotion cost them their lives. And having realized that he could rewrite the rules of human connection, he turned his gaze toward the proudest, most arrogant segment of Roman society, the aristocracy, and prepared for them a humiliation so intimate, so degrading, that it would stain their bloodlines for centuries. If the forced mourning of Drusilla was an assault on the private emotions of the populace, the second act of Caligula's machine was a calculated strike against the very foundation of Roman identity, their honor. To understand the gravity of what came next, one must realize that for the Roman aristocracy, dignity, or dignitas, was not merely a social nicety. It was the currency of their existence, more valuable than gold, a legacy carefully cultivated over centuries of conquests and governance. To strip a Roman nobleman of his dignity was to execute him socially, leaving him a hollow shell. And it was upon this vulnerability that Caligula built his most grotesque institution, the Imperial Brothel. Ancient historians, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe this establishment not merely as a place of vice, but as a bureaucratic engine of degradation located within the sacred precincts of the Palatine Palace itself. But Caligula did not fill these rooms with common slaves or captives of war. That would have been too ordinary, too predictable for a mind-seeking total psychological dominance. Instead, he staffed this house of shame with the wives and children of Rome's most distinguished senators and knights. Imagine the scene through the eyes of a patrician father. You are a man who commands legions, a man whose ancestors defeated Hannibal, whose name is carved into the marble of the Forum, and yet you receive a summons that you cannot refuse. You are ordered to bring your daughter, the pride of your lineage, educated, refined, innocent, to the palace. Upon arrival, you are not greeted as a guest, but as a vendor. The corridors are lined with heralds who shout out prices to the passing public, advertising the daughters of the Senate as if they were livestock in a cattle market. The clientele consists of freedmen, soldiers, and commoners, men who, in the rigid hierarchy of Rome, should be bowing to you in the street. Now, they are purchasing access to your bloodline with a handful of copper coins. But the true horror of this system lay in the ledger. Caligula meticulously kept a book of accounts, recording every transaction, every name, every coin exchanged. This ledger was not just for profit, it was a weapon of blackmail. By recording these acts, he created a permanent, bureaucratic record of the aristocracy's shame. He would often invite these broken fathers to view the ledger, praising them for their patriotism and their contribution to the imperial treasury. It was a masterstroke of psychological torture. He forced these men to become complicit in the violation of their own families, transforming the patriarchs of Rome, the supposed protectors of virtue, into silent partners in their own destruction. They could not speak out, for the shame was too great. They could not revolt, for their names were written in the book. He had trapped them in a prison of their own humiliation, ensuring their loyalty not through respect, but through a shared, suffocating secret that stripped them of the moral authority to challenge him. But Caligula understood that public humiliation, while effective, lacked the intimate, visceral terror of a personal encounter. The brothel was an institution, a system. He needed something more immediate, something that would allow him to savor the fear in a man's eyes from across a dinner table. This brings us to the third act of the machine, the banquet of predation. The imperial dinner parties of Caligula have become legendary in the annals of history, but not for their culinary excellence. They were theatres of cruelty, carefully staged to remind the ruling class that their lives, their wives, and their bodies were the personal property of the emperor. Let us reconstruct the atmosphere of such an evening, using the sensory details that the ancient chroniclers hinted at but often left unspoken. Imagine you are a senator, invited to dine in the Apollo room of the palace. The invitation is not a request, it is a command. You arrive with your wife, dressed in your finest togas, the heavy wool stifling in the humid Roman night. The room is a spectacle of opulence. Walls lined with purple tapestries, golden lamps casting a flickering, oily light that makes the shadows dance like restless spirits. But beneath the scent of roasted peacock and spiced wine, there is another smell, the sharp, acidic reek of cold sweat. 50 other couples are present, reclining on couches in the traditional Roman fashion. The conversation is brittle, forced. Laughter rings out a little too loudly, a little too quickly. Every eye is darting toward the head of the table, where Caligula reclines. Watching, he doesn't eat. He observes. His gaze is clinical, predatory, moving from one woman to the next, inspecting them with the detached curiosity of a butcher evaluating a prize heifer. The silence that falls when he stands up is absolute. You can hear the sputtering of the lamps. You can hear the shallow breathing of the man next to you. He begins to walk slowly around the tables. He stops. He leans in. He lifts the chin of a senator's wife, turning her face left and right, checking her teeth, her skin, her composure, and then, with a simple gesture of his hand, he summons her. He does not ask your permission. He does not even acknowledge your existence. He leads her away, out of the dining hall, into the private chambers adjacent to the banquet. The heavy doors close with a finality that echoes in your chest. And now begins the true torture. It is the waiting. You must remain on your couch. You must continue to drink the wine that now tastes like ash in your mouth. You must make polite conversation with your colleagues, all of whom are meticulously pretending that your wife has not just been taken by the emperor. The minutes stretch into hours. The imagination becomes a far worse tormentor than reality, conjuring images of the unspeakable acts taking place just a few walls away. But the crescendo of this psychological warfare occurs when the doors open again. He returns. She returns. She is disheveled, her eyes fixed on the floor, her spirit visibly broken. But Caligula is energized. He returns to his couch, and then, in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, he begins to review the encounter. He describes her performance. He critiques her body. He compares her to the other wives he has taken in previous weeks. He strips away the last shred of privacy, turning the most intimate violation into a public spectacle. And you, the husband, the protector, the Roman man, what do? You do not draw a knife. You do not shout in rage. You smile. You nod. You raise your cup in a toast to the emperor's vitality, because you know that hidden behind the tapestries are the Praetorian guards, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. You know that a single frown, a single tear, would mean not just your death, but the extermination of your entire family. Caligula effectively turned every dinner guest into a hostage, and every banquet into a lesson in absolute helplessness. He proved, night after night, that the social contract of Rome was dead, replaced by the whim of a single man. Yet, even in this abyss, there remained one bond that the Romans believed was sacred, untouchable, stronger than marriage, stronger than honor. The bond between a parent and a child. Surely, even a monster would respect the sanctity of a father's grief. But Caligula, in his relentless pursuit of the ultimate power, saw this sacred bond not as a boundary, but as a challenge. He wondered if he could force a father to deny his own nature, to laugh over the corpse of his son, and in the fourth act of his machine, he would find the answer in a display of cruelty so profound that it shocked even the desensitized historians of the ancient world. If the violation of a wife was a strike against a man's honor, the destruction of a child is a strike against his future, his immortality. In the twisted laboratory of Caligula's mind, he sought to discover the breaking point of the most primal human instinct, the protective love of a parent. This brings us to Act 4 of the machine, the violation of nature. The primary source for this atrocity is the philosopher Seneca, who writes not with the detached tone of a historian, but with the trembling hand of a witness to the unholy. He tells us of a Roman knight named Pastor. Pastor was a man of standing, a father who had raised 2 sons to serve the empire. But one of these sons, for reasons that remain lost to the capriciousness of history, perhaps a minor slight, perhaps simply because his youth offended the emperor's fading vanity, was arrested. The order was given for his execution. Pastor, desperate, swallowed his pride and begged for his son's life. But Caligula, seeing the raw, naked vulnerability in the father's eyes, did not see a reason for mercy. He saw an opportunity for an experiment. He denied the request, and the boy was executed that very afternoon. But the machine was not finished. Whatever horror you imagine a father feels in that moment, Caligula demanded that it be suppressed. Immediately following the execution, while the blood was likely still wet on the executioner's blade, Caligula sent a messenger to Pastor. It was not a condolence, it was an invitation to dinner. And Pastor, he went. Why? Why would a man break bread with the murderer of his child on the very day of the killing? Seneca gives us the chilling answer. Habebat alterum. He had another son. Caligula knew this. He knew that he held the life of the surviving brother as collateral. So, Pastor arrives at the palace. Imagine the physical sensation of walking into that room. The smell of the same perfumes that masked the scent of death in the corridors. The sound of music that must have felt like a drill boring into his skull. Caligula placed Pastor in the seat of honor. Directly facing him, he ordered wine to be poured, and he ordered Pastor to drink. He ordered the musicians to play a lively tune, and he ordered Pastor to listen. And throughout this macabre feast, Caligula never took his eyes off the father's face. He was scrutinizing every micro-expression, hunting for a single quiver of the lip, a single tear, a single shadow of grief. If Pastor dropped his mask for even a second, if he allowed himself to be a father, the second son would be neutralized before dessert was served. So Pastor sat. He drank the wine that must have tasted like the bitterness of his own soul. He nodded at the emperor's jests. He smiled. Seneca writes that he did not merely endure, he performed. He acted the part of the grateful guest, while his heart was undoubtedly screaming in the silent void of his chest. This was Caligula's ultimate victory. He had not just killed a boy, he had forced a father to desecrate the memory of his own son to save what remained of his family. He had proven that fear is stronger than love, that the instinct for survival can be twisted to override the most sacred laws of nature. He had broken the human spirit completely, or so he thought, for in his hubris, in his absolute certainty that he had mastered the physics of the human soul, Caligula made a fatal calculation error. He forgot that while fear can silence a senator who has everything to lose, and it can paralyze a father who has a hostage to protect, it has a very different effect on a man who has nothing left but his pride and a sword. He forgot the soldiers. This leads us to the final act, the fatal error. The instrument of Caligula's demise was not a grand political rival, but a man named Cassius Dio, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. Dio was not a soft aristocrat. He was a creature of the frontier, a veteran who had spilled blood for Rome, a man whose body was a map of scars earned in service to the empire. But to Caligula, Dio was just another plaything, a prop in his theatre of humiliation. Caligula found it endlessly amusing that this hardened killer had a voice that was slightly high-pitched, a soft cadence that belied his lethal profession. Day after day, year after year, Caligula chipped away at the one thing a soldier values above all else, his masculinity. When Dio would approach the throne to ask for the daily watchword, a sacred military protocol essential for the security of the palace, Caligula would not give him a standard code like victory or Mars. Instead, he would lean forward, a sneer curling his lip, and whisper words like Venus or Priapus. He would offer his hand to be kissed, but form it into an obscene gesture. He forced Dio to repeat these words, to carry them to the other soldiers, making him the punchline of a joke that echoed through the barracks. Caligula believed this was harmless fun. He thought Dio, like the senators, like Pastor, would swallow the insults because he feared the emperor, but he failed to understand the soldier's code. A senator might rationalize humiliation to save his estate. A soldier sees humiliation as a form of death. By stripping Dio of his dignity, Caligula had inadvertently freed him. A man who has lost his honor has nothing left to fear. The machine had pushed its gears too hard. And finally, a cog snapped. The date is set, January 24th, 41 AD. It is the final day of the Palatine Games. The atmosphere in Rome is festive, frantic, distracted. Caligula is in the theatre, enjoying the spectacle, unaware that the air around him is charged with the static electricity of betrayal. Around noon, he decides to leave the games to take a bath and have lunch. He chooses a route less travelled, a narrow, subterranean corridor known as the Cryptoporticus. Visualize this space. It is not the open, sunlit forum. It is a tunnel, claustrophobic and dim, the walls sweating with dampness, the acoustic deadness absorbing the noise of the crowd outside. It is the perfect kill box. As Caligula enters the shadows, his German bodyguards are momentarily separated from him by the press of the entourage. He is alone, though he does not know it. Out of the gloom steps Cassius Dio. Caligula, arrogant to the last second, expects the usual ritual. He expects the soldier to bow. He expects to deliver one final, stinging insult. But today, the script changes. According to the accounts, Dio asks for the password. Caligula gives a mocking response. But instead of accepting it, Dio draws his gladius. His voice, no longer soft, cracks through the silence with a single command. Accipe ratum. It drives into the emperor's neck, the sound of steel meeting bone echoing off the stone walls. Caligula, stunned, falls to his knees. He does not scream for help. He screams, "I am still alive." A final, desperate delusion of his own immortality. But the illusion is shattered as the other conspirators swarm him. The historians record 30 wounds. 30 times the steel pierces the flesh of a god who turned out to be made of meat and blood. They strike him in the chest, the face, the groin. It is not an assassination, it is an obliteration, a release of 4 years of accumulated terror, poured out in a frenzy of red violence until the most powerful man on earth is nothing more than a ruined heap on the cold stones of a dark tunnel. The monster was dead, but the true horror, the horror that justifies the title of this story, is what happened next. Because when you build a machine of absolute brutality, you cannot simply turn it off. It has momentum, it has hunger. The conspirators, intoxicated by the violence, did not stop at the emperor. They hunted down his wife, Caesonia. She met her end weeping, not for herself, but for the madness that had consumed her husband. And then they found the nursery. The ancient sources are sparse here, perhaps because the reality is too difficult to write down. They found Julia Drusilla, Caligula's daughter, a toddler, no more than 2 years old. She was innocent of her father's crimes. She was a child who played with dolls and looked at the world with wonder. But to the men who had been broken by Caligula's system, she was not a child. She was a seed of the monster that had to be crushed before it could take root. We will not describe the visual. We will only speak of the sound. The heavy boots of a soldier entering the quiet nursery, the confusion of a child being lifted from her crib, and then a sickening, dull thud against the marble wall, followed by a silence so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the entire future of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. A wooden toy rolls across the floor, coming to rest in a pool of shadow. The ledger was closed. In the hours that followed, the Senate met in the temple of Jupiter for a brief, shining moment. The dream of the Republic flickered back to life. They spoke of liberty. They spoke of ending the tyranny of the Caesars forever. They believed the nightmare was over. But while they debated in high rhetoric, the Praetorian Guard was looting the palace, and behind a velvet curtain, trembling in terror, they found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the family fool, the man everyone had ignored. The soldiers pulled him out, but they didn't kill him. They looked at him, and they did not see a man. They saw an opportunity. They saw a paycheck. They saw a figurehead. They hoisted him onto their shoulders and proclaimed him emperor. While the Senate was writing speeches about freedom, the military had already chosen the next master. The system survived. And this is the haunting truth that Caligula leaves us with. 2,000 years later, we often look at history's monsters as aberrations, as singular evils that appear, destroy, and vanish. We want to believe that Caligula was just a madman, an anomaly, but the uncomfortable reality is that Caligula was not the disease. He was the symptom. He was the product of a system that concentrated absolute power in the hands of one flawed human being. A system that stripped away checks and balances until the only law was the whim of the strongest. He showed us that the institutions we trust, the law, the military, the traditions of society, are fragile constructs. They can be weaponized. A ledger can become a tool of blackmail. A dinner party can become a torture chamber. A nursery can become a slaughterhouse. Caligula built a machine of psychological terror, and though his body was left to rot in a shallow grave, the blueprint of that machine remained. It was picked up by Nero. It was refined by Domitian. It has been used by tyrants in every century since, from the steppes of Asia to the bunkers of the 20th century. So, as we look back at the marble ruins of Rome, we must ask ourselves, is the machine truly broken? Or does it still hum quietly in the background of our world, waiting for the next operator to take the controls? The shadow does not vanish when the sun sets. It merely waits for a new light to cast it.